In sicer pod naslovom Unconditional, the Idea of Peace in Political Context bo svojo predstavitev predstavil Tomaž Mastnak. So actually I should switch to English. So we are approaching the last part. So Tomaž Mastnak holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Ljubljana. His primary area of research is the emergence and articulation of conflictual relations between East and West, Christianity and the Muslim worlds, and Europe and the non-European worlds. He is the author of numerous books and articles on the history of political thought and political theory. He has been a researcher fellow at the Institute of Philosophy of the ZRC-SAZU, the European University Institute, the University of Oxford, the American University in Cairo, Harvard University, and New York University.
Thank you for the introduction. So I will be with one foot still in the subject matter of the previous panel in history, but hopefully we'll get to the problematic field of the sections that Nina just announced. So it's hard to imagine anyone would question the idea of peace. Actually, questions about peace have a long history that goes back to the Bible. Jeremiah, for example, lamented, "Small and great alike, all are greedy for gain. Prophet and priest all practice fraud. They have treated lightly the injury to my people. Peace, peace, they say, so there is no peace." In book of wisdom is written, "They call so many and so great evils peace." Of the Romans, Tacitus said, "To ravage, to slaughter, to usurp under false titles, they call empire. And where they make a desert, they call it peace." A frequent inscription on Roman medals, Tacitus commentators remind us, was "peace given to the world." What that Pax Romana in fact gave to the world was violence, plunder, destruction, and fear, of which even those who shed blood were not free. As Augustine eloquently put it, "For the Romans always lived in dark fear and cruel lust, surrounded by disasters of war and the shedding of blood which, whether that of fellow citizens or enemies, was human nonetheless. The joy of such men may be compared to the fragile splendor of glass. They are horribly afraid lest it be suddenly shattered." Such passages were transcribed, read, preached, printed, and commented on through the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment, when Leibniz, D'Alembert, and Kant all wrote of the peace of the graveyard. Leibniz, undoubtedly a man of peace, reported to friends that he has seen something of the project of Monsieur de Saint-Pierre for maintaining a perpetual peace in Europe. I am reminded of a device in a cemetery with the words "Pax Perpetua," for the dead do not fight any longer. D'Alembert, in his praise for Saint-Pierre, mentioned a Dutch merchant who saw a sign at the cemetery that read "A paix perpétuelle." And Kant, the most ironic of all, said with his dry humor, mentioned with his dry humor a satirical inscription on the signboard of the Dutch inn on which a graveyard was painted, which read "Perpetual Peace." Like Leibniz and D'Alembert, Kant was referring to Abbé de Saint-Pierre and his peace plan for Europe, envisaged as a union of all European states. Kant commented on that plan a number of times, as did countless other public figures in the 18th and 19th century and beyond. A most notable comment by Kant on Saint-Pierre's peace plan is the following: "Should the abbot of Saint-Pierre most zealously pursue his idea of the one and only republic of all the states of Europe, he would be a fantast who actually rests his idea on a lot of reason, yet lacks reason with regard to the execution." In fact, this is quite a common reservation or objection to otherwise praiseworthy ideas of peace or peace plans. The idea itself is good, but how to realize it? How to translate theory into practice? But in my view, the problem with Saint-Pierre's peace design was neither the lack of reason nor the lack of ideas about its execution. It was precisely his well-reasoned plans for the execution of his peace design that make one pause to reflect upon peace. There is a popular saying that when reason sleeps, monsters awake. But when reason is awake, it may produce even worse monstrosities. Some such monstrosities have been generated in the name of peace. Monstrous crimes against humanity are committed in Palestine by self-styled coalition of peace as we speak. But let's stay for another moment with Saint-Pierre. Saint-Pierre's peace plan was, in its essence, I'm citing now, a plan to make the way to a universal crusade incomparably more solid and better concerted than all the previous. European princes should make a perpetual peace and chase the Turk out of Europe. By the time he wrote, early 18th century, the Turk became the symbolic figure of the Muslim. So Europe should make perpetual peace and chase the Turk out of Europe. The indissoluble Pacific European Union would be an offensive league for the extermination of the Turks. What had ever been more glorious and more important to Christianity, Saint-Pierre asked, than to establish everlasting peace among all the Christian princes as a necessary step of efforts to exterminate these infidels. The great objective of this Enlightenment crusade was the conquest of everything that the Turks possess in Europe and on the Mediterranean islands, in Asia and Africa. On the ruins of the Turkish Empire, Saint-Pierre explained, could be established many new Christian sovereignties. European union and peace were the only means for making Europe and European political order reign in all the parts of the world. So this thought is here so clearly expressed that I will repeat it because it's all over the history of Western thought, but here it's really nicely expressed. So European Union and European peace were the only means for making Europe and European political order reign in all the parts of the world. Abbé de Saint-Pierre was an immensely popular figure in his time. His ideas circulated widely. His peace plan was much discussed. Sometimes it was ridiculed and sometimes subjected to friendly criticism. But no one disputed the linkage of peace to the project of a universal crusade. Given how literati of the Age of Reason related to the allegedly dark ages in which the Crusades were born and flourished, this might be surprising. It did. Philosophers and historians such as David Hume in his History of England came to consider the Crusades a folly. And yet, in Saint-Pierre's self-understanding, his crusading peace plan was an expression of the universal progress of reason that required the annihilation of Mohammedanism and other human religions. This raises the question, why did the philosopher's rejection of religion not extend to the rejection of religious war? In this paper, which I had to cut for the presentation, I argue that in Western tradition, holy war is overshadowing just war. I argue that the Crusades were a model holy war and that they had survived as an institution until 1940, when the last crusading bull had expired. Even greater longevity had the crusading spirit. It lives on. The ideas, images, language, iconography, sentiments, and attitudes associated with the Crusades left a lasting influence on what is usually called Western civilization. The crusading spirit guided Christopher Columbus when he discovered the Americas. The crusading spirit decided the treatment of American native populations. We can see how the crusading spirit shaped European expansionist campaigns against non-Europeans, colonial wars and colonial rule, and fed into the modern-day imperialism. World War I, in fact, was presented in both Europe and in the United States as a replay of the Crusades. The Crusades were a point of reference in the recent war in Bosnia. The list goes on. President Bush II represented the so-called global war on terror as a crusade. The victims of the war against Iraq saw the war as a crusade. Lately, The war against Russia in Ukraine and the war against Palestine invoke crusading imagery as well. The two great wars that are taking place in our days are holy wars. The war against Russia in Ukraine is a liberal holy war, and the war in Israel against the Palestinians is a war made by fanatics inspired by the biblical Amalek. I'm talking about war because the nature of war determines the nature of peace. What does the predominance of holy war in Western tradition mean for peace? Just war, justum bellum, is proclaimed by a legitimate worldly authority to recover lost goods, be they real property or incorporeal rights. Just war is fought within the limits of law to redress an injury caused by the enemy. Holy war, in contrast, is a willful exercise of arbitrary violence unleashed in the name of God and is fought against a universal, fundamental, existential, irreconcilable enemy. It requires the construction of such an enemy. The First Crusade had constructed the Muslim as such an enemy and bequeathed that image to the future generations. But the Crusades were also fought against Christian heretics in the West. The most known example is the Albigensian Crusade, while the so-called Northern Crusades attacked the pagan Western and Orthodox Christian Eastern Slavic peoples. Drawing on an apparently superhuman authority, holy warriors consider their enemies subhuman and treat them with deliberate utmost inhumanity. Finding a fundamental existential enemy placed outside the human law, holy warriors themselves step out of the bounds of laws of war and law itself. They regard themselves as superior to their enemy and believed to be the elect or chosen people, a higher civilization or race, Übermenschen and über alles, and what is an American translation of über alles, an exceptional nation. The worst of this sense of supremacy is the dehumanization of the enemy. Today, Ukrainian Nazis are declaring the Russians not human and are backed by the Euro-American Russophobes, while the black-shirted Israeli Minister of Defense is calling the Palestinians human animals. The logical conclusion of the dehumanization is the eradication of the enemy. Holy war is a war to the death, a war to extermination. Killing the enemy is not homicide, it's seen as a malicide, the annihilation of evil. The term malicidium was coined by Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century, but that language is spoken today by a number of Israeli government officials and their Euro-American allies. Whereas in their view, Israel is fighting pure evil in human form, the Nazis in Ukraine are regarding the Russians as insects. Just as the medieval crusaders' goal was to cleanse the Holy Land of the infidels, and the goal of the early modern successors to chase the Turks out of Europe. Now we hear calls for erasing the Russians and Russian culture from Ukraine and for eradicating the Palestinians from Gaza and, in the next steps, from the Eretz Israel. In 20th century language, we call this genocide. While we today sometimes describe violations of the laws of war and of the humanitarian law as war crimes and crimes against humanity, we, as a rule, neither decry nor persecute these crimes when they are committed by us or our proxies. Worse still, we have sunk to the point where the power elites in the collective West are abetting the genocide with a considerable popular support. They are, more precisely, we are complicit in it being genocide. Our Western civilization is showing its genocidal face. Talk about a humanitarian disaster in Gaza instead of naming it for what it is, a crime against humanity, and calls for humanitarian aid, painting a human face on genocide. Such humanization of genocide is a disaster for humanity. What kind of peace is possible in our postmodern holy wars, if it's possible at all? Logically, holy war as a fight to the end can only bring about peace of the graveyard. Yet, in political life, logic never runs smoothly. The problem is, however, that the political life itself is under threat of extinction. What I find very striking in view of the war in Ukraine is that the political elites in the West are expressis verbis rejecting peace. They provoke the war, and they routinely called it Putin's unprovoked aggression. They dismissed Russian offers for finding a diplomatic solution to the conflict. They vetoed the ceasefire negotiated between Ukraine and Russia in March 2022. The first so-called diplomat of the European Union insisted that the solution to the conflict had to be found on the battlefield. Throughout the war, the EU-USA had escalated and continued to escalate the conflict. They have explicitly rebuffed even timid calls for peace and strive for nothing less than a total defeat and total destruction of the enemy. The war against Palestinian people is waged by the self-styled forces of peace, which have until now categorically rejected even the thought of a ceasefire. They are making desert to call it peace. Gaza is the modern-day Carthage, only that the Carthaginian peace today is not total subjugation of the enemy population. That was, in fact, the state of affairs before the start of this war, but it's extermination. The peace the Israeli government is pursuing is the accomplished genocide. Except for the vague idea of the elimination of the enemy, neither of these wars has a political strategy. The Israeli military itself says it has no coherent strategy and endgame, and the same is true of the EU-USA in Ukraine. In addition to this, media narratives have completely taken both wars out of the historical and political context. Decontextualized, they have been depoliticized. The Gleichschaltung of Western mainstream media and the total propaganda, which has engulfed even those who are spreading it, have made it impossible to think about the war politically. Or, to be more realistic, it made it very hard to think about the war politically, because some of us keep trying to think about these things politically. War has ceased to be the continuation of politics by other means. Instead, it has become the substitute for politics. This change makes it impossible to find a political solution to the conflict, that is, to end the war and make peace. For peace is necessarily a result of politics. The only option is held to be the elimination of the enemy, whereas peace requires finding a modus vivendi, some form of coexistence, or else it can only be peace of the graveyard. The inability to think about the war politically and its liberal usage in the place of politics is generated by a deeper malaise in the West, by the decline of politics in general. The unprecedentedly incompetent, corrupt, and often outrightly stupid, even if clever and perfidious, political elites are a symptom of their decline. By classical definition, politics is about taking care of the public common affairs of a civic community. With the deconstruction of the state as public authority and big private economic interests taking control over the channels of political decision-making, the politics withers away. With the withering away of politics, as I said, war ceases to be the continuation of politics by other means and becomes a substitute for politics. War ceases to be an institution and becomes a horrifying freedom of destruction. Taken this into account, could peace be anything but the crown of destruction? War as a substitute for politics affects as well the society that is waging war. Our societies are being militarized. In the process, we are not only being conditioned to condone, embrace, and even demand all kinds of crimes up to genocide, losing all moral compass. We are also sinking into a state where the unaccountable power elites are waging war against the underlying population. For when politics disappears, what remains is war. Yet this is not the war of all against all. It is a war of a tiny minority against the majority. This is not the return to the state of nature, for nature we have effectively destroyed. This is a progress to the post-natural and post-political and thus post-human world or state. Withering away of politics is the result of an extremely unequal distribution of power and wealth. It is also it is also cementing power relations characterized by this inequality. In such conditions, peace could only be the annihilation of the chosen enemy and the pacification of the domestic subject population, its domestication. But as long as the powerful can kill with impunity, and the oppressed have to resort to violence if they hope to regain a modicum of human dignity, we will live within the fragile splendor of a glass house filled with the dark fear and cruel lust, to return to the Augustine's words I cited in the beginning. Our language will be the language of violence and war, coated with Orwellian propaganda of peace and democracy. If we are serious about peace, we need to relearn political language, revive politics, and radically change power relations within our societies and in our world. Thank you for your attention.